One of the best moments of player choice ever in a video game revolves simply around a single soda can. The player approaches a guard, and the guard kicks the can down onto the ground. You can pick up the can, throw it in the trash, and the guard lets you on your way. But you can also pick up the can and throw it at the guard. He'll give you a nice beating for your troubles, but still forces you to pick up the can in order to progress. In order to move forward, the game tells you that you must pick up that can. You have no choice. This choice comes in the first 5 minutes of Half-Life 2, and is perhaps the only real character choice you can make in this heavily narrative-driven, story-focused game. Yet despite it being a singular moment of player agency in a video game where you simply walk on one path that you're on, what's really remarkable about this choice is that it's an act of violence against not only the character, but against the player themselves. I want to talk about how Half-Life 2's opening few minutes uses something unique to the video game medium to really get across the harm and damage that systemic violence can cause, and how this specific moment with the can exemplifies all of it, to not only the character in the game, but to you, the player. Now, there are nearly endless reasons why Half-Life 2 is a masterclass in video game storytelling. From its elegant way of letting you put yourself into the silent protagonist of Gordon Freeman, to all of its wonderful, amazing set pieces and wonderfully written characters.
Gordon Freeman? Let me get a look at you, man.
That's not even to mention the actual story itself. All of this is why I personally pick up and play Half-Life 2 pretty much on an annual basis, going back to it each year because I still feel that there are few games, if any, that have surpassed its ability to use the unique properties of the video game medium to articulate its themes. But this moment right here represents one of my personal favorite moments in all of video games. Not only because it is an act of violence against you, the player, but because it uses that violence to clearly define to you the violence enacted by a totalitarian society around you and explore the themes that the game wants to discuss. How so? Well, let's talk about violence and what violence actually is. Violence is the removal of choice. I'm not saying that the removal of choice is a form of violence. I'm saying that we could define all violence itself as the removal of choice and agency. When we think of violence, we tend to think of physical violence. Someone getting punched or shot or hurt, or if I took a crowbar to a head trap. Yeah. But not all violence has to be physical. But to explain that, let's go back to the beginning. Or rather, the end of the beginning. At the end of Half-Life 1, once you finally defeated the game, the G-Man shows up to offer you a choice.
That's why I'm here, Mr. Freeman. I have recommended your services to my employers, and they have authorized me to offer you a job. They agree with me that you have limitless potential. You've proved yourself a decisive man, so I don't expect you'll have any trouble deciding what to do. If you're interested, just step into the portal, and I will take that as a yes. Otherwise, well, I can offer you a battle you have no chance of winning. Rather an anticlimax after what you've just survived.
But if you don't enter this portal, he teleports you into the middle of several aliens, and we learn that you die. So your choices here are to do what the G-Man wishes, or be murdered.
Time to choose.
But if you step into the portal, no physical harm comes to you. If anything, you escape harm. Yet, in that situation, the threat of the physical damage that could come to you has limited your agency, your ability to choose a different outcome. You had to step into that portal or you'd be killed. Your ability to choose had effectively been removed by a threat of violence, not actual harm. And even if you disagree with me and you decide not to step into the portal, the physical violence that you would face after that point, again, removes your choices. Your ability to choose the condition of your own body. And in death, the ability to choose anything else. This lack of choice is compounded even further at the beginning of Half-Life 2, where the game assumes you chose to step into the portal, even if for some reason you didn't at the end of Half-Life 1.
The right man in the wrong place can make all the difference in the world. So wake up, Mr. Freeman. Wake up and smell the ashes.
Now, that decision makes sense by the developers, because if you didn't make that assumption, there wouldn't be a game to play. But philosophically, even the limited choice you had at the end of Half-Life 1 has been completely negated here. Violence is the whole or partial negation of agency through force or the threat of force, not simply physical harm to a body. If I threaten to mug you with this crowbar, and I just take your wallet and you're not hurt at all, that's still a violent crime, even though no one actually got hurt. The threat of physical violence, the threat of harm, either mentally, emotionally, or psychologically, removes your choice and is therefore violent. Half-Life 2 evolves on the ideas of its predecessor and develops and deepens this understanding of the inherent violence in the elimination of choice. It does this by showcasing the difference between subjective violence, the violence we've been talking about, violence that has a clear and obvious perpetrator, like a mugger or the G-Man, to objective violence, or the violence that has no clear perpetrator and is often just overlooked as how things are. Objective violence itself is broken into two separate categories: symbolic violence and systemic violence. We're going to put aside symbolic violence for this video to talk more directly about systemic violence. Systemic violence is, quote, the violence inherent in a system. Not only direct physical violence, but also the more subtle forms of coercion that sustain relations of domination and exploitation, including the threat of violence. The first thing you see when you arrive in the dystopian future of Half-Life 2, after the G-Man that is yet another train car. This car is mostly empty, yet it's certainly not the sterile train car of Half-Life 1. This is not a happy place, or a safe place. Bullet holes and graffiti line the windows. Papers are strewn across the floor. This is a place where violence happens. Yet you don't actually see any of this physical violence. You just see its aftermath, instantly making you recognize the tenuous nature of the space you now inhabit. I mean, look at the other passengers on the train. None of this is concerning to them. The bullet holes are just part of it. Something happens to you on this train, there's nothing you can do about it. And already, in the first few seconds, giving you this oppressive nature of the possibility that violence could happen to you, and no one will care. But none of that's actually happening to you right now, but you know it could. The moment you step off the train, you can tell someone is in control here, and it isn't you. Combine soldiers push you away if you get too close. We see a man looking for his bag, all he has left, and he's forced to keep moving. Fear and paranoia permeate these corridors.
They're always departing, but they never arrive.
To emphasize this, you see a Vortigaunt in the station. The Vortigants were your constant torments in the first game. The aliens that you had to stop over and over and over again with your crowbar to just barely defeat them. Yet this Vortigaunt is simply sweeping the floor. If you look closely, you see a collar. The biggest threat that you have ever faced is defeated, controlled, and it's certainly not being controlled by humanity. You look up and hear Dr. Breen, the controller of City 17, speaking from on high.
Welcome. Welcome to City 17. You have chosen or been chosen to relocate to one of our finest remaining urban centers.
Chosen or have been chosen? Here in this city, you don't always get to choose if you come to City 17. It's just decided for you. Yet even more ominous is the mention of our benefactors.
I thought so much of City 17 that I elected to establish my administration here in the citadel so thoughtfully provided by our benefactors.
Well, we later learn that these benefactors are the Combine, an alien race that beat all of humanity in a mere 7 hours. At this moment, they're just a mysterious mention. Just framed as benevolent. But just one look around and it's clear that they're anything but. Listening to more of Dr. Breen, we learn that the benefactors have set up a suppression field, limiting humanity's ability to breed.
We should thank our benefactors for giving us respite from this overpowering force. They have thrown a switch and exorcised our demons in a single stroke.
While Breen continually tries to frame this as a benevolent idea from the Combine, done for our betterment, it again just is another example of a loss of agency. Yet no one seems to be questioning it. All of this is just simply built into the system around you. Sure, there are some shoves and pushes, maybe a beating here or there, but on the whole, things just feel ominous. There's no outward physical violence. This is objective violence and systemic violence at its core. Just background noise in the system. One that we're able to see clearly as outsiders. And maybe even people who live there can see it to a degree, but most of the citizens of City 17 just see it as part of their everyday life.
This is how it always starts. First the building, then the whole block. They have no reason to come to our place. Don't worry, they'll find one.
We can see that this entire system set up by the Combine is inherently violent, continually whittling away at the choices that everyone has, and yet it's not hurting you directly, not physically harming you. And when someone completely removes all your other choices, whose choices are you left to follow? At some point, a small robot camera hovers over you and takes a photo. You are being watched, seen by someone else whose intentions you couldn't possibly know. Already, you're asked to think about how someone else might see you, might think of you. These bots float around the entirety of City 17, watching anything and everything that you do. Philosopher Jeremy Bentham came up with the idea of the hypothetical prison called the panopticon, a circular prison with cells built into the walls and a central tower that can see into every cell, and in turn, every cell can see that the tower is there. Yet the prisoner can't see into the tower itself, but can only see that it's a physical presence, an oppressive figure. At any moment, a prisoner can't know that they are being watched, but they know that they might be. They can't even see the others around them. They are isolated, and the only relationship that they have is between them and a tower. So if your only relationship is between you and a tower that may or may not care, you tend to imagine that it does care about you. It's watching you at all times because you need that relationship. But if it's watching you at all times and it doesn't necessarily have your best interests at heart, well, you're going to be thinking about their interests over your own. Philosopher Michael Foucault built upon the idea of the panopticon. You can not only have panopticon cells or prisons, but schools, hospitals, mental hospitals. Hell, even video games themselves are forms of panopticons. See this wonderful video to learn more about that. But what if you could make a panopticon country? Surveillance in any land where it is ubiquitous and inescapable generates distrust and divisions among its citizens, curbs their readiness to speak freely to each other, and diminishes their willingness to even dare to think freely. When you are left with no choices, the choices of the state, of the country, become synonymous with your choice. When you walk through security, you are pulled into another room by a Combine officer. We catch glimpses of violent interrogations behind closed doors. You walk into a room with a single seat, surrounded by blood. Again, there's no obvious violence, but the threat is clear just from a single glance. You look over at the civil protection soldier, this inhuman monster who will harm you, and he removes his mask to reveal a very human face underneath. A friend's face, in fact.
It's me, Gordon. Barney from Black Mesa.
This specter of violence has become immediately human. And sure, that moment sets into motion the plot of the game, but what does this actually mean? That all those men in masks out there that were perpetuating the system are simply other people too.
I don't know about you, but I'm ready to join civil protection just to get a decent meal.
People join the Civil Protection Service, become agents of the very system that oppresses them because they have no other choice. It would be easy to see these folks as simply evil, given the brutality on display. However, we later learn in the game, if you listen closely to the transmissions, that not only are they motivated by privileges to get more food, but punished if they fail.
Planetary mission termination will result in 50% rank points, 50% reproduction credits, immediate amputation, permanent off-world service assignment.
Again, coercion and the threat of violence is being used to limit your choices. The one clear overriding message here is that everyone who lives here has no choice. The only choice they have are the ones given to them by the state. Go here, do this, whittle away everything you have. It's a violence of the mind, a violence to your autonomy. Perpetrators of violence dehumanize their intended victims and look on them not as people, but as inanimate objects. Totalitarianism is a form of rule in which the government attempts to maintain total control over society, including all aspects of the public and private lives of citizens. You are a body. You are an object. You are a thing. You are a... So this brings us back to this moment. This moment perfectly encapsulates the entirety of the world you have been shown so far. Even this guard who pushes over this can is emblematic of the entire cycle. This guard is removing your choice, and yet they were also in many ways forced to become a civil protection soldier. Needlessly, they perpetuate the cycle, spiraling it downwards all the way to the very bottom from the very top, all in the service of goals that aren't even their own. Here, you have no real choice but to pick up the can if you want the game to progress. Video games are all about agency. That's the one thing that sets the entire medium apart from any other. You have choices, whether that's making a story choice in games like Mass Effect or the ability to create whatever you want in Minecraft. So here, in this moment in Half-Life 2, in preventing you from going forward and not giving you the choice of either picking up the can or not continuing the game is committing an act of violence against you. I'm not talking about the threat of the guard hitting you, because that's almost irrelevant to you as a player. No, the game is threatening you with the inability to continue with the game, unless you pick up that can and put it into the trash. This moment is a microcosm of all of that, right here. It's all in this single moment, and all you have to do is pick up the can and throw it away. And at least you, the player, know that you have the luxury of fighting back against the system that caused you to put that can in the trash in the first place. You will defeat them eventually. Eventually. Yet this moment in the game became a huge deal for a lot of gamers. It even became a meme, with tons of players trying to refuse to put the can in the trash. Why do so many of us have this impulse to resist even this simple moment? Is this simple act of defiance emblematic of our entire collective ability to stand up against totalitarianism whenever it rears its ugly head? We can fight back. We will fight back because we can see through it. We know better. Except, do we? For you see, certainly, Gordon Freeman goes on to fight the Combine throughout the rest of Half-Life 2. But do we, the player, choose to do that? Or are we just continuing down the path that the developers laid out for us? When you enter into the world of Half-Life, it feels big and wondrous and broad. It feels like you can go anywhere, explore everywhere. Yet, as you go through the game, you realize that you only have so far that you can explore, that there is a path that you need to follow. Yet it never really feels like that. The game creators are just so good at manipulating you, at pushing you into making you feel like every decision that you're making, every decision down the path that they put out for you, was your choice. When you enter City 17 proper, you have to go to the right and head toward Dr. Kleiner's lab. There are blockades everywhere else. There's nowhere else for you to go. You have to go down this one critical path. The only door open in the building is the one door that you have to go through. Yet, it still feels like you're exploring this area, that you're getting a chance to see and sneak around alleyways and go past all the guards, and it feels like it's your choice, but it most definitely is not. Later in the game, a cave-in forces you to go to Ravenholm. More and more coincidences force you to go down the game's critical path. Yet the creators continually tell you that you are being forced to do this. The G-Man watches you from afar throughout the game, as if he knows exactly where and when you will be. The defeat of the Combine at the end was all his plan to begin with. You had no agency in any of this. You had no choice. This was a path that was laid out for you.
Rather than offer you the illusion of free choice, I will take the liberty of choosing for you. If and when your time comes round again.
Yet, we don't really think about that, because it's just business as usual. That's just how games are supposed to be played. We go through them and play the stories that the developers want to tell us, and we follow the will and the intentions not of ourselves, but of our benefactors. I think that all of us hope that if we find ourselves in a world where violence exists, that we would all be the ones to not pick up the can. That we would all find the way around it, because it would be so clear to us what was wrong and what was right. Yet, there is violence in this world, the real world, that all of us miss because it's just how the way things are. We don't question it because, well, that's the way it always has been, and it feels normal. So, if we truly do want to not pick up this can, then the first thing we need to learn is to recognize what might be invisible to all of us. The systems that limit choices for not only ourselves, but for others around us, instead of just simply throwing away the can so we can simply move on with our day. Actually, no, sorry. This is actually a park, can't litter. Sorry, I cleaned it up, I picked it up. I'm trying to save the planet. So, yeah, I cleaned up. Oh God, that's a system, isn't it? And special thanks to my commander level and above Patreons, Stefan Schuhart, BBD, Boyd and Marybeth Earl, Michael McGee, Lal Lindley, Wellington Marcus, Munir Amlani, Mari Neckar, and Marika Kuyechin.